Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not align with either major party, if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more than two parties on the ballot, and if you are one of the majority of Americans ready to see change, welcome home, my purple people. Now, with the election over, Democrats and Republicans have put an end to the partisan sniping on the campaign trail and have regrouped in Washington to commence the hard work of fighting with members of their own party. Now, while centrist Democrats debate whether they are a left or center-left party, Trump's team has begun not so subtly threatening senators who've expressed issues over cabinet appointees with sexual assault allegations and appointees who have expressed sympathetic views to China and Russia, and no one has said so much of a whisper about the guy who says he has a brain worm with a penchant for stealing away with animal carcasses. So this is where we are. With intra-party factions becoming more at odds with each other, a group of legislators has proposed a novel reform. Make it easier for them to break up. We're going to talk about that, but first, Shawn, I think we have some good news and we have some weird news. Where do you want to start?
Definitely some good news. Definitely some weird news. I think, and we were texting about this before, and I mentioned, you take the good news when it comes these days, especially after there's so many people who are disheartened and not really that excited following this election cycle and exhausted, to be honest. And so you're going into a Thanksgiving week, hoping for a little peace, and we got a couple of good things. Alaska voters rejected repeal of their all candidate, all voter top four primary with ranked choice voting in the general election by a very slim majority. It was very close. One of the closest elections in the country, if not the closest. And then, Matt Gaetz withdrawing his name from consideration. And I will say that it doesn't really matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, independent, third party supporter. Matt Gaetz not being Attorney General is good news. It's good news.
Yes, without a doubt. I can't for the life of me figure out what the strategy is here. Like I'm honestly looking to figure out what Trump is trying to slip by us with these cabinet appointees, because they're all questionable.
Right.
It's like looking at a Where's Waldo book, and trying to find the bad one.
Right.
Like they're all questionable. Matt Gaetz, hands down, the worst.
Mm-hmm.
The worst.
Well, and you have to wonder because part of you wonders, and you don't want to necessarily just put on the tinfoil hat, but part of you wonders if he was going to withdraw from the start. And because you have all this speculation, all this talk on Capitol Hill about the ethics report against him, the allegations being made against him within that report, and by people who were directly affected by said sex trafficking and sex offense allegations against him. If this was possibly a way for him to leave the House under the cover of precedent.
Yeah, I'm in line with you there. I think that ethics report was coming out. I think his nomination, look, he couldn't have thought he was going to have an easy path to nomination.
Right.
The guy has arguably made more enemies within his own party than he has outside.
Right.
Literally. So he couldn't have imagined this was going to be easy. And I would say certainly it's a way to get out gracefully and potentially subvert the release of this very embarrassing ethics report.
It was very weird too, because he had that day where he and JD Vance went to go meet with senators to kind of, I guess, test the waters of what his confirmation would actually look like. And at the end of it, when he was interviewed, he said, "Oh, it was good. We had good conversations. I'm feeling good about the hearing coming up." Right. And then the next day he withdraws his name after saying, "I'm looking forward to the confirmation hearing." But, oh, wait, now I'm out. I don't want to be a distraction which is too late, by the way. And that's the thing what we were talking about with Trump's picks is they're all distractions.
Well, that's it. You don't want to be a distraction. That's the whole administration. One
Right.
enormous distraction after another.
Mhm.
Part of you wants to say that these nominations are an effort to distract from some subversive agenda and keep us from seeing what's really going on behind the curtain.
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it's far more simple. I think Trump values loyalty. I think he values media appearances, and I think he's staffing a cabinet accordingly.
Oh, I agree. I think, to your point, I don't know if there's anything nefarious going on behind the scenes other than MAGA people supporting each other, and even
Yeah.
if it means helping them with things like ethics investigations, like, and for that is nefarious. But also, like, I don't think there is some sort of deeper state kind of tinfoil conspiracy theory other than MAGA is looking after MAGA, and Trump values loyalty, and he is looking for those who he knows will be yes men and women to him.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I wanted, before we get into the meat of the episode today, I want to jump back to the referendum in Alaska,
Mm,
because I do think it's important to get into some of the details there. So we've talked about this before. The Alaska's system of open nonpartisan primaries combined with ranked choice voting implemented in 2022 and has faced a large amount of criticism, mainly from the right,
mhm,
mainly from Republicans. The main reason for that is that they've lost elections. So in the special election in 2022, it was Democrat Mary Peltola, Sarah Palin from the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and then Nick Begich, a more traditional establishment Republican. Uh, the Republicans lost for the first time in about 50 years. Peltola won. Second election happened just a few months after in November. Same lineup again, same outcome.
mhm.
Peltola wins, Palin and Begich lose. And so there was this feeling amongst Republicans that this new system of open nonpartisan primaries with ranked choice voting disfavored their candidates. We move on to 2024. Peltola has lost.
Yes.
So Begich has won. The interesting thing, though, was in that election, the other leading Republican dropped out of fear that they'd split the Republican vote. That doesn't make a ton of sense because Alaska uses ranked choice voting. So I can cast my ballot for my number one favorite Republican first, and then my second favorite Republican second. There's nothing that stops that from happening. I think the reason that the Republicans lost back in 2022 is because there's a large number of Republicans and independents, for that matter, who don't like Sarah Palin and opted for a Democrat as their second choice.
Right, and we even looked at the turnout numbers. Republicans were complaining about the system, but they were also not turning out in the numbers that they could turn out to affect the outcome of the race. And you're right. There's really no need on the ranked choice voting for anyone to worry about splitting the vote. That's the point of ranked choice voting. And it speaks to perhaps the Republican Party in particular not adjusting quite yet to RCV. But I think what could be the most beneficial thing to reform right now is Begich winning, because now Republicans can't say, look, we can't win on the ranked choice voting. It inherently benefits Democrats. It doesn't. It just benefits the Democrat who's the most preferred of the voters who participate, which requires both you to turn out Republicans as well as appeal to independents. And it requires you to have a candidate that has that sort of broad appeal and people want to vote for as not just their first choice, but also their second choice.
Yeah, 100%. And it's definitely sending a signal to the Republican Party, at least in Alaska, that they really need to be putting out moderate candidates in this environment. And really what you've seen, and you saw this in the Senate election in 2022 as well, the more moderate Republican ultimately ended up winning. So, Lisa Murkowski, who had voted to impeach Donald Trump, was one of only a handful of Republicans who survived a primary challenge, primarily because of ranked choice voting. So I think it sends a signal to the Republicans that, again, if you're going to compete in Alaska or you're going to compete in any ranked choice voting environment, you can't have some dark MAGA, hard MAGA candidate there. Same thing in Maine, which uses ranked choice voting. Susan Collins wins consistently for the same reason, moderate Republican.
Right. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they have to be moderates. They just can't be extreme. They can't be staunch ideologues.
True.
So it's not necessarily that you need to be moderate, but I absolutely agree. And then, I mean, research from the 2022 elections showed that these were the type of candidates who were most likely to win under this type of nonpartisan system. You see in states like California, which also has a nonpartisan primary. We talked about David Valadao last episode winning, and he being a less extreme Republican, not having to run in a primary where he would have to run for the 28% of that district that's Republican, but he's running in a primary where the voting pool is all registered voters in the district. So you see the impact that nonpartisan systems have. And thankfully, because Alaska voters rejected repeal, we'll continue to see the effects. And hopefully Republicans will see how a nonpartisan system can benefit them if they put up candidates that voters want to vote for.
Agreed. And this actually fits in with what we're going to talk about quite well, because what we're seeing currently in Washington, both on the Democratic and Republican sides, are the factions within each party vying for control over the platform. So we'll start with the Republicans. We've already talked about this. Trump just sent a parade of horribleness through Washington with his cabinet appointees, and some senators have expressed reservations. So specifically, obviously, Matt Gaetz, chief among them. There's concerns about Pete Hegseth, lack of experience, and now sexual assault allegations for Secretary of Defense. Tulsi Gabbard, who has had allegations of being sympathetic to China and Russia, if not overtly allied with China and Russia, for Director of National Intelligence. A number of Republican senators have expressed reservations about all of them. Like I said before, RFK Jr. completely flying beneath the radar. Like, the guy who's going to take fluoride out of drinking water and ban vaccines and McDonald's, totally cool. We're going to let this guy skate through.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how no one is really talking much about RFK Jr. right now in terms of his lack of experience in the role that he was put in. If he was put in an environmental agency, I could understand that because he was an environmental lawyer, right? So that's his background. Even though I may not agree with that appointment, it makes a lot more sense than putting him in anywhere near healthcare. But what you are seeing with these picks is, and the media has talked about this too, is a test of loyalty, not just from those who are being appointed, but from senators. And perhaps this is Trump's way of testing that and seeing where that is this time around compared to 2016. And he may be okay if the Senate rejects some of these picks, but this is his way of saying, well, how much can I get away with in the next 4 years?
And there have been threats from within the Trump camp that senators who defy Trump's wishes are going to see primary challenges funded by Elon Musk.
Funded by Elon Musk and supported by prominent conservative activists like Charlie Kirk and some of these other right-wing talking heads that really have the ear of the type of voters that would show up for primary elections. So it's just how the system we have works. Speaking of the contrast of what a nonpartisan election system does versus the partisan primary system, which we've talked about in other episodes, do in much of the rest of the country. Because they attract such a low turnout, because the voting pool is so small and the candidate choices are so limited, that allows special interest, a extreme grassroots movement, the party itself to tell their incumbents and tell candidates, hey, if you want to keep your seat, you got to do what we say. You got to toe that line.
The interesting thing is that the Republicans already have two potential defectors in Susan Collins and in Lisa Murkowski. Now, Lisa Murkowski can't be primaried out.
Right.
Susan Collins can. So even though Maine uses ranked choice voting, Maine has partisan primaries, meaning that people will be casting ballots for their favorite Republican in that. And that is something that could make it harder for her, although she seems to have a pretty good handle on her seat. So I kind of doubt it.
Although if I'm Trump and I'm his supporters, I'm paying attention to the party insiders who say be very careful about going after Susan Collins. Because if you push this too much and you put in a candidate who is very detestable in Maine, then the Democrats will take over that Senate seat easily. It's one of those situations right now in Maine where Susan Collins keeps her seat because she's a moderate, because she gets enough Democratic support on her side of Democrats who are just sad. They're happy with what she's doing. You know, they're fine with having a moderate Republican as long as she's not too overtly Republican. So that benefits her. But if they kick her out in the primary and replace her with someone who falls more to the extreme, that seat could become a Democratic seat easily.
Well, and this is the rub here, that what we see are overt measures by Trump and the MAGA wing to solidify their control over the party.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, what we also see is that MAGA candidates have a really tough time winning in the Senate. In the House, it's a little different because the districts are so lopsided towards one party or the other. It's very easy for them to take over the House. The Senate, winning a statewide election, entirely different story. And what we saw in the 2022 midterms was that hard MAGA candidates lost every election. Carrie Lake lost this year in a statewide election in Arizona, a state that Trump carried. The only real hard MAGA candidate, I think, who flipped a seat was Bernie Moreno in Ohio, and that was a Republican-leaning state anyway, right? So, I mean, Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat, had long odds regardless of who was in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like in Montana too. Like that is a heavily Republican state. So the fact that John Tester was even close to keeping his seat is, in my mind, a testament to how, again, moderate and how representative he was of his state and how much people liked him. But yeah, I mean, him keeping his seat, that was always going to be the challenge, regardless of who the Republican was.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the greatest wish of Democrats would be for Trump to start primarying disloyal Republican senators. And I think what we see here in terms of this intra-party conflict and what we saw in the primaries is that the MAGA wing is strong in the party, but it's not the whole party. And if we just look at how the Republican primary played out and what polling indicated before, you're probably talking about 60% of Republicans are MAGA, and the remainder are just Republicans who would like to see a more conservative vision for the country, regardless of who gets in there. They just want somebody competent. But 25% of the electorate are registered Republicans. So when you say 60% of Republicans, you're right there. You're talking about 15% of all voters. It's not a lot.
Not a lot.
Yeah. I want to move on here to the Democratic side because, while the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is trying to assert control over their party, the Democrats are just trying to figure out who's in charge at this point. There was some great reporting in Politico this week on the subject. And what you have are centrist Democrats really blaming the party's loss on progressive messaging and an overemphasis on identity politics. And one Florida DNC member saying, I don't want to be the freak show party. And then when you look at the group of people who are running to be chair of the Democratic National Committee, they're all centrists, who are looking for a more pragmatic approach aimed at middle-class American voters. But there's also pushback from the left. Now, the left is calling this, which I found kind of funny, they're calling it the white guy winter. most of the candidates running to chair the Democratic National Committee are white guys.
Right.
And so it's almost like there's this, identity politics backlash going on in the party right now.
Well, and just this claim that that Democratic candidates were too progressive this election cycle. Jon Stewart had a great segment about this, about where he highlighted, all these embattled Democrats in swing states were so much to the middle and tried so hard to stay in the center that they ended up going right on a few issues like immigration, right? And you could see this in their campaign ads. Kamala Harris campaigned with Liz Cheney. I don't know how much to the center you could have gotten with the way that Kamala Harris ran her campaign at times. And the incoming first trans member of the House of Representatives, Sarah McBride, had noted, for all this talk about how Democrats focused on identity politics, no, it was the Republicans. And somehow the Republicans convinced people that it was the Democrats who were so obsessed with this.
To be frank, I think this is a lot of hand-wringing over nothing. Because I'll get back to what I said last episode or the episode prior. This was an election about the economy, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump won with a fraction of a percent over 50%, barely won the popular vote. He did not win a majority of voters in Wisconsin or Michigan for the third time in a row.
Right.
This was an election about the fact that the price of groceries went up and stayed up. That's what this is about. Americans are not feeling good about the direction of the country. And when they don't feel good about the direction of the country, they vote whoever's in the office out. That's how it happens. And so to say, oh, we talk too much about, who gets to use the bathroom, doesn't matter. The same campaign under a good economy would have done better.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go back to one of my ideological pillars, which is partisanship is baked in, and there's this sliver of the electorate that just wavers back and forth and decides things based on the conditions of the day, right? Trump lost in 2020 because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
He lost in 2020 because people felt bad because they were locked in their house because of COVID. That's it. If there was no COVID and the economy was good, he would have won again. Mm-hmm. George Bush started a war.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And he got reelected.
Right.
That's how they're determined. So stop talking to me about, oh my God, what's our strategy going to be? You're the only two options.
Right.
You're the only two options, right? If I buy Pepsi, it doesn't mean Coke has to go and change its secret formula. It's the only drives me up a wall.
It's absolutely insanity.
But there's something too, I want to touch on here, which is America's political parties have always been marriages of convenience. And these marriages are often composed of very odd partners. And I'll give you a great example. FDR's New Deal coalition was the coalition most likely to include active members of the NAACP and active members of the Ku Klux Klan. Not former members of the Ku Klux Klan. Active, cross-burning, hood-wearing Klansmen. That was FDR's Democratic coalition. And the reason he was able to get these people under the same exceptionally large tent was because of his economic programs. Poor Southern whites loved the economic program, and poor Black Southerners love the economic programs, okay? In America, because of the way our elections are structured, that effectively force people under two parties, you very often have these factions that are at odds with each other. And so the idea that any party could settle on a coherent message is amazing in and of itself, right? This kind of gets us off to the next headline from this week, which was Joe Manchin coming out and being the second former member of Congress I can think of, the first being Liz Cheney in, again, the past year or so, who's stated the need for a third major party. And his feeling was that the Republican and Democratic parties have gotten too entrenched. They rely on vitriol and polarization to mobilize their voters, and they're becoming less and less effective because of a lack of competition. And so Manchin has come out and called out the duopoly specifically and said that we really need to introduce more competition into the political market. Now, Manchin, as you know or may not know, was one of the people floated to lead No Label's bipartisan unity ticket in 2024, which never happened. So he's been out there, and I wouldn't be surprised if, part of floating this is an effort to kind of grow his own coalition outside of the two major parties. But the one thing I'll note is that when you look historically at third party bids, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are led by former members of one of the two major parties who sort of take a coalition of voters with them.
Right. And then for the sole purpose of realigning the major party that they left to begin with. That has been really the key role of minor parties and third parties in the history of the United States. Now, there was a time, even around FDR's time, where you would see a lot of third party members in the U.S. House of Representatives. This gets into how, when you have individual districts like that, you can push forward more, more diverse type of candidates under the right type of political system. And back then, they had what's called fusion voting, which means that parties can have or nominate candidates who are multiple different types of parties. So, they still have fusion voting in New York still.
Explain to me how that works. I have to be honest, and I'm going to be ashamed to say this as somebody who advocates for electoral reforms. I just didn't like the name and didn't read into it. So tell me all about it. My heart's open.
Yeah. So fusion voting allows a candidate to run for the nomination of multiple parties. A lot of states don't allow that these days.
Mm-hmm.
They only allow you to run for the nomination of a single party. And partisan primaries have helped kind of instill that into the system, because you run as a Republican, you run as a Democrat, whoever wins on those respective tickets goes on to the general election. And then a third party candidate has to, get certain number of petitions if they want to show up in November. And so in New York, they still have fusion voting. However, it feels like, because of just the grip that the major parties have on the process itself, what you've seen is kind of a watered down version of fusion voting. So you have third parties like the Working Class Party, or the Working Families Party, that will just nominate whoever the Democrat nominates. And you'll have the Conservative Party, who will just nominate whoever the Republicans nominate. So it's a watered down version of a system and a process that used to lead to candidates who could be on a third party and still find appeal with, say, a major party and get elected throughout the rest of the country. But again, because of the partisan structure of our system and the way that the major parties have further entrenched themselves,
Mm-hmm.
the way that they have, behind partisan primaries and the partisan structure of our elections, you don't see that anymore. And in fact, you haven't seen a third party member of Congress in a long time. You see independents, like Bernie Sanders continues to get elected in Vermont. He's popular, but a lot of times, if a member of the House, for example, if they become independent, it's because they switched parties while they were in office. They weren't elected as independents.
Yes. One thing before I move on and address what you said, which is, I didn't mean to sound dismissive of fusion voting. I just feel like the electoral reform space on the whole needs to pick a lane.
Oh, I agree.
Because there's all these options: fusion voting, star voting, proportional representation, ranked choice voting, top 4, top 5. First off, for this reform to happen, you need to convince the average person that this is a good idea. And when you present all these different options and say, oh, well, this one's better because of this, and this one's better. And, the math on this one works out better. Like, it's almost like, when you walk into Best Buy to get a TV and there's like 800 TVs, and then you ask for help and they're like, oh, well, this one has 4800 ADP and LCD behind it, and it's got a Bluetooth and blah. And you're just like, dude, just give me a TV that's this size where my kids can't lose the remote. Like, that's all I want. I don't understand anything you're saying. And that's what the average person hears. So I'm speaking strictly to electoral reformers here.
Yeah.
If it involves math or the word condorse it, just stop. Just stop it. Okay?
Right. Well, and then so like the ranked choice voting people picked up on this in terms of their messaging, which I feel is why you've seen an explosion in that reform. And regardless of the statewide setbacks that reform faced this election cycle, it still grew. It was still approved in the nation's capital.
Yeah.
It's still being approved in some large cities in the country, used for the first time in Portland. And I think one of the key factors that went into that is they shifted their messaging away from the technical aspects of ranked choice voting. Right? Voters don't really need to hear the mechanics of how it works. They need to hear, how is it going to actually benefit me as a voter?
Exactly.
And I think, to your point, that is the message that reformers need to be working on right now. Whatever they're putting out there, whether it's nonpartisan primaries or ranked choice voting, voters only need to hear, how does this benefit me? How does it lead to better representation? How am I going to be heard more, whether it's in the state legislature or in Congress? How is my voice actually going to matter? Because a lot of voters don't feel like their voice matters. And to clarify, I wasn't necessarily saying, oh, we should push fusion voting out there. I was explaining how third parties used to be able to have representation in the House. And since then, the parties have been able to create this system that within its umbrella, you have the media, you have pollsters, you have political consultants, all operating under the same umbrella, that have been able to endorse this idea that people only have two parties. And so now people don't even look at third parties. People need to realize there are a lot of third parties in the United States. They just have such niche appeal, and they're not really focused on kind of building up their support.
Yeah.
That no one really pays attention to them.
Well, yeah, and there are some structural disadvantages that they have.
Yeah.
We'll steer clear of ballot access laws. We'll steer clear of some of the other strategies that both major parties use to suppress these nascent parties from growing. And we'll talk strictly about the structural stuff. So first thing you need to understand is that America's system of elections, called first past the post, is one that automatically favors two major parties. And I'm going to fill in the blanks in case you're unfamiliar with this. If you've made it this far in the podcast, you probably are, but let's go over it anyway. So in a first past the post system, you get one vote for one person, and the person with the most votes wins. And it sounds perfectly logical until you realize that the most votes could very well be 34% in a three-way race, right? So you don't need a majority, you just need the most. So as a result, voters tend to vote strategically. They line up behind one of two major parties, because voting for a smaller, less established party could potentially be wasting your vote, right? Now, the second problem we face in the US are single member districts, and the fact that each congressional district only has one member. That wasn't always the case. That was something written in a law back in the 60s. But so you get one vote for one person in one party in one district, at least in the House of Representatives. And so what that does is it makes it a lot easier for the parties to carve districts in their favor. And it makes it a lot easier for them to create districts that are safe, create districts that, again, even the opposition major party has a tough time competing in. So this week, there was another story that hit the newswire about a proposal by the Blue Dog Coalition. So this is a coalition of moderate Democrats, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington and Jared Golden of Maine are proposing a bipartisan task force to explore how to fix this. And a couple of things they talk about are expanding the House. The last time we expanded the House was 1929. Obviously, population has increased immensely since then, but also introducing multi-member districts and proportional representation. So what that means now is that you have a district that, let's say, has 3 members, and a party is awarded a seat in that district based on their share of the popular vote. So you could have a district that's 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and maybe 1 Libertarian or Green Party member. These are the systems that are used in true multi-partisan democracies. So, Germany, Ireland, Sweden. This is a system that is used by 9 of the top 10 ranking countries in the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. And I think more importantly, this would allow those different factions within the 2 major parties to take their ball and go home, right? The progressive Democrats don't have to fight with centrist Democrats anymore, right? And establishment Republicans don't have to fight with MAGA Republicans anymore over their party's platform. They just build a new party. Mm-hmm. And whoever has the best platform wins.
Yeah, and I'm open to the concept of multi-member districts under proportional representation. I think it's an interesting idea. I think there is a conversation to have with our current electoral environment, the benefits of splintering factions even more, and what that would actually do for furthering legislation.
When both parties in this country can only agree on the fact that the opposing party is a threat to democracy, I think we can argue something isn't working too well. Interesting factoid I'll put out there too. Marjorie Gluesenkamp-Perez and Jared Golden are both from states that utilize alternative forms of elections. So Gluesenkamp-Perez from Washington, they have top 2 primaries, open, nonpartisan primaries. Jared Golden, Democrat from Maine, ranked choice voting. Now, the only problem I have with this task force is getting back to something you said earlier. There is zero benefit to the 2 major parties in doing this. And this would require this to be passed into law federally.
Right. There's a lot of institutional forces right now that would be opposed to reforming the process this way. And especially when you look at states that are so heavily partisan and which that partisan control has such a strong grip. Their incentive right now isn't to back a system that would allow for proportional representation. Their incentive is to hold on to their power, and the best way to do that is to preserve the status quo. And we saw this. We saw the messaging that they would use, the tactics they would use, the deception that they would use to prevent the status quo from changing in those statewide efforts to reform primaries in states like Colorado and Arizona, and Nevada and Idaho and Montana, South Dakota, all those states. The messaging that came from the parties, particularly the parties in power, was often to deceive voters in the intent of the reform itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I personally think the best angle to attack this is at the state level, because good luck getting a law passed. They can't even pass a budget. So ain't going to happen. And I do think that the state level is an area where activists can have a real impact. I mean, we saw some losses this election cycle. Alaska was one small, very thin victory, but a victory nonetheless. And we've talked about this before. Strong need for voter education to make this happen. I think the fear I have with going full proportional is that what you are going to see are more left-leaning states gravitate towards the concept first. And then what you'll have this situation where you have multiple left-wing parties and one unified Republican Party. This is what happened in Hungary, where the left wing was really split amongst a number of different groups. So I think what you're better off doing is finding a solution that can help moderate or encourage candidates to moderate.
Right. Well, and then you also have to consider the messaging from that, because when you have a reform in which it starts to grow in more blue and left-leaning states, the messaging from the right is going to be, well, this reform is just going to turn us into them, right? That was one of the leading messages for Idaho Republicans this cycle for not moving to a top four system with ranked choice voting like Alaska, was that it was going to Californicate Idaho. That was actually on signs that voters could see outside. Their messaging was that it was going to Californicate Idaho, which is absurd, but that's what they.
I think what motivates politicians for change is when they feel they're going to lose power. And getting back to something I said earlier, if we look at past successful third-party bids, we see people who left to give their faction more power. So Teddy Roosevelt split off from the Republican Party to form the Progressive Party back in the early 1900s. You had Strom Thurmond and George Wallace both launched their own third-party bids in the 40s and then 60s in protest of their party's embrace of civil rights. And with all three of them, what you saw was some sort of realignment, or at least some sort of decision reached about the direction of the party. What I find interesting is that all three of these bids were driven by very strong personalities. And once those personalities faded, the whole movement died. Now, the interesting thing this time around is Trump has almost done that in reverse. He's the personality, and he's bringing in a faction of people into the Republican Party to change the platform. But he's also a very personality-driven movement. MAGA is a very personality-driven movement. And my feeling is once he fades, MAGA fades with it. Because as I mentioned earlier, MAGA candidates other than Trump have a really tough time winning. Now, tying this all into electoral reform, I do think that as the parties become more fractured, it's going to be harder for certain people to see their future within the confines of the two-party system. So Liz Cheney found that out. Joe Manchin found that out. I think arguably Kyrsten Sinema found that out. And I think as more people who understand how to acquire power and more people who understand how politics work find themselves outside of the circle of the two major parties, I think that's when you might start to see more movement to break up the structures that enable the duopoly. And I think it's happening. But I also think, again, speaking directly to the listener, it also takes individual people taking action.
And to speak to reformers, it takes a ground up approach. And we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. You got to start at the ground level. You got to focus on grassroots, focus on voter education, and build from there. Because I think the mistake that a lot of reformers made this time around was starting from the top, spending a lot of money on ads that were going to flood the airways. And it didn't move the needle at all for reform. Voters didn't know what they were voting for, so they didn't vote for it.
Yeah. And for the love of God, no math.
Yeah, no math.
No math. Nobody cares. Right. All right, man. I think we are going to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to rate this episode, subscribe, and share this with anyone you think might like it too. We grow by word of mouth, specifically your mouth. We will be back next week. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.